And perhaps some of you have already seen Ferruginous Hawks too. And I got a message about being recorded. Perfect. All right. Then, is your slide changing? Oh, nope. There it is. There's a delay. Oh no, what have I done? Okay, well, let's start there. uh, so, oh, I need to update this slide. I've actually finished my PhD. The take-home message for this slide is that there's a huge team of people that are working on Ferruginous Hawks. The project is led by Dr. Aaron Bain and Dr. Troy Wellicombe. Some of you might even see some familiar faces. Probably some of you know Ryan Fisher. And this has been a really fruitful project with a lot of collaborators, partners, and has also just been a real joy to be a part of. We've got so many people to thank too that I like to put the slide near the front to kind of just cover my bases because we work with so many landowners. We have had a ton of staff and volunteers come out and help us in the field. I was telling Anna, we've had probably 18 to 20 undergrad researchers working on the project too. And we've worked so closely with the Alberta Recovery Team and the National Recovery Team that have provided so much feedback and guidance with this project that this project is really standing because of all of these people. And I guess to give people a background, I've given this talk to people from kind of all over, but I feel like it's always new to some folks that haven't been down to say southern Saskatchewan off Highway 1 driving to see really what native prairie looks like. And it's a really scary thing because we've really experienced a lot of grassland conversion to cropland, which has then resulted in this loss of natural habitat. This has a lot of different consequences, and a lot of recent studies have shown that this loss of grassland habitat has been pretty closely linked and has likely caused many declines in bird populations that are dependent on that grassland habitat. The grasslands have also changed in more ways than just conversion to cropland. We see so many more human features on the landscape now. In some areas, there is a lot of oil and gas. Helium extraction is a new one that's out on the landscape. In Saskatchewan, we've got a lot of potash mines that have a large footprint. We also see more and more wind farm developments popping up in different places in the province too. And so right now, the landscape looks very different now than it used to, say, 500 years ago. Some of this new feature can have positive effects on the landscape for wildlife, but some of it can also have negative. And the question then is how much is too much, and do these things compound each other? Then when we stack another component of cumulative effects onto the landscape, we've got not only that loss of natural native grassland, added human features in terms of infrastructure, we also have climate change playing a big role here too. In the grasslands, climate change is here, it's happening, we've seen it, producers on the land see it, and what we're seeing now and expecting more of into the future are changes in those weather patterns. So we're expecting to see increasing seasonal temperatures, warmer summers, warmer winters. We're expecting to see less precipitation during the summer. But when we do see some precipitation in the summer, we are seeing it in the form of extreme weather. So more extreme storms, more severe storms, and likely more frequent storms too. And certainly while doing field work out there, the weather in the last 10 years has really looked different than, say, the first 10 years of my field work out on the grasslands. It's definitely apparent. So when we've got these cumulative effects on the landscape, they start to add up. We've got some native grassland in green. This is my hyper techy landscape simulation that I created with clip art here. I've got yellow for cropland. I've got green for native grassland. We see some of that conversion. So we see conversion of grassland to cropland. We've got some cattle out on the pasture. Maybe we've got some linear development for roads. Add on top of that some energy extraction infrastructure like oil pumps. Add some more roads because each of those oil pumps need a road that goes out to it. Everything needs power out there as well. We have new power lines, single power lines that go out to gas oil pumps. We also see more transmission lines out on the landscape too. Then, particularly in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where we have new transmission lines, these big utility power lines that go through the landscape, then people who are developing wind power are also eyeing where those transmission lines are going to. And then, as we add climate change and these severe storms to the system, there's a lot more things that are different acting on that landscape. It looks very different and it behaves very differently now than it used to 500 years ago. And then we think about then what's left on the landscape for wildlife, and we then wonder how that wildlife navigates and uses and how well they do out on that landscape too, then really poses the question that is our overarching theme for the Ferruginous Hawk project out in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. So Ferruginous hawks, best species, maybe? I'm not sure. Bold words, I know. They are North America's largest boodio species. So they're the largest soaring hawk that we find in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Their wingspan is about 5 feet. So their wingspan is about as wide as I am tall. They are very, very big. They're found in open country, so shrub steppe, grasslands, sometimes cropland, deserts in some places, and badlands too throughout North America, as you can see on the range map that's here. We get them in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. It's the northern part of the range where they come up in the spring to breed, and then they go back to warmer places in the winter. They often are nesting in trees. Historically, they spend a lot of time nesting, or sorry, historically, before we planted a lot of trees on the landscape, they did nest a lot on the ground, on hillsides, on coulees in the Badlands. And this is a really cool photo that's actually from the Maple Creek area from the early 1900s that Amy Nixon gave me, that she found in some of her family photos. And so this is what a historical Ferruginous hawk nest looks like. Some of them still look like to this day in places where there's fewer and fewer trees, or few trees to begin with. In places where there are trees, then they seem to have a preference to have an elevated nest structure. Why are they up here? Why did they come all the way up here to breed? Well, there is probably the obvious answer to that is that there's really great food that's out there. We have so many Richardson ground squirrels out in our grasslands, and they are essentially like the #1 food item for Ferruginous hawks. In another component of my research, I was looking at brood provisioning, and so we had these video cameras set up at nests and catching all these deliveries, and we really found that Richardson ground squirrels are essentially the #1 food item, their favorite food item, most plentiful, most biomass, that gets delivered back to the nest. And you can actually see these like cute little snacks getting dropped off, and we've got, I think, 25,000 hours of video of nest video we've gone through a lot of it, and there's still some to be left over. So we've got a lot of ground squirrels, and so therefore these guys actually are likely up here because there's all this food that's available. Unfortunately, Ferruginous hawks are a species at risk. They are currently listed as a threatened species. They've been declining. They experienced a really steep decline starting in the 90s. And there's lots of guesses as to why their population started to decline. Is it partly loss of habitat, or some of those food limitations occurring? Have Richardson ground squirrel populations changed? And then a number of other potential threats to the species too. And so there's a lot of, for somebody who was looking for a research project, a research question, there were an endless number of questions to start to tackle. And so here we are. One of the big concerns out on our prairie landscapes, where we have a lot of human development, those human features that I was talking about before, a lot of human activity out there too. We're driving around, there's people going out to the infrastructure to service them every day. Is it not only the change to the landscape that could potentially be affecting these birds, but could it also be the human activity that's associated with it? Ferruginous hawks have historically or traditionally been considered really sensitive to human disturbance. If you look at them the wrong way, they will abandon their nests immediately. There's actually like descriptions of them throwing young out of the nest, and it was this really strange kind of mythology that grew around Ferruginous hawks. And I still actually get a hard time for having done nest monitoring and other work with these birds really closely. And I track some of these stories back to some of the work that was done in the early 80s. There was some experimental work done to see how sensitive Ferruginous hawks were. But the tricky thing is that these studies were done in early May, so it's very early in the nesting season. They might still even be laying eggs. They have low investment in the nest so far. And what these studies found is that if you walk up to a nest approaching while firing a shotgun at increasing nearness to the nest, they will abandon their nests. But that's a pretty invasive type study to test whether or not a bird will flush off a nest and whether a bird may or may not abandon the nest. So I think a lot of this really just originated there. So they've shown that there can be some individual response, but then the question is, does that escalate up to extrapolate up to a population effect? And it was always so peculiar to listen to these stories and get warnings from people about disturbing Ferruginous hawks when they're in some places very common. So we've got them nesting on oil and gas infrastructure. This is my favorite nest. We found it partway through the study, and that's why we know it's a brand new nest that was built. It's on the corner of the highway that goes down south to Maple Creek and on Highway 1. On a slow day, it gets 5,000 vehicles past it. On a busy day, it gets 10,000 vehicles past it. And it nested successfully there 2-3 years in a row. So how sensitive are they? Are these anomalies, or what type of patterns are the patterns behind this for Ferruginous hawks, and can we learn from understanding that better? So I'm going to walk through some of the highlights of the research that I did for my PhD. I've clipped out a couple of sections that I think are interesting. Well, I think it's all interesting, but we don't have time for all of it. So I'm going to cover habitat use and reproduction, and then talk a little bit about conservation and management recommendations. I've set the talk up to talk about some of these landscape characteristics. What does the landscape look like? What have we added or changed? And then also how climate can potentially affect it too. And so in this case, we looked at, we did look at climate normals for one component of the study, and we looked at seasonal weather for some of the more recent field collected data. The work took place in southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan. This is the last remaining grassland that's out there. So you can see that there's some patches of lots of grassland, lots of patches with lots of cropland. These are oil and gas wells that have been superimposed onto the same map. So you can see that there's uneven distribution of this type of energy infrastructure. It's highly clustered, but in some areas, it's also very, very dense. So the first question was, well, where are they putting their home ranges? Are they actually being choosy about it, or are they just going wherever there's a tree or wherever there's a ground squirrel? So I looked at home range habitat selection across the study area using an opportunistic data set that was essentially assembled from multiple data sets that ran from 2005 to 2010. We had over 2,000 nests. And we looked at the landscape around each of those nests and described what it looked like and looked to see if there were any patterns using a pretty traditional RSF approach. I looked at the geography, land cover, industrial development, climate, and soil characteristics around those nests. And so, yeah, there are patterns behind where Ferruginous hawks are selecting to choose their home ranges. Turns out they like to have a bit of a mix of grassland and cropland. They like some edge, not too much, and they tend to be to select places that have some edge. They also seem to be nesting closer to water. This also goes against the grain because a lot of people have traditionally thought of Ferruginous hawks as this very grassland dependent species, that they are this iconic flagship species for native grassland, when they're kind of like a lukewarm. They like that heterogeneous habitat. They like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They also seem to have a pattern where their home ranges were closer to active oil wells, and they also seem to be in places where there was a higher resource road density too. We did see some climate and some soil patterns too, and they tended to be found in places that had warmer, more stable temperatures, and then a suite of soil characteristics. So it turns out we can actually predict where they have their home ranges pretty well. Darker colors are where they're more likely to select home ranges, lighter colors are where they're less likely. And so we can build a predictive map like this based on GIS layers on those variables and have a good idea of where some of those hotspots might be. So we have a pretty good prediction of where home ranges might be, but we also want to know how well they're doing out there and also how that density or abundance across that landscape can change depending on how that landscape looks too. And so looking at habitat quality was important because we wanted to see not just where they might be found, but also does their habitat use and reproductive performance match or are they potentially mismatched and why that might be. This portion of the study was is all data that we've collected over a number of years, and we did all of our data collection in a very stratified block design. So we made sure to look for nests and to study nests in places that had very little human infrastructure out there. So grassland with little infrastructure, some, and then lots. And then we also looked at landscapes and the addition or the more mix of cropland to the landscape too. So we studied birds with very little cropland, some cropland, and all cropland around. And then we also, because we're interested in those cumulative effects, we also looked at birds nesting in all cropland with varying amounts of industrial infrastructure to it too. So then we're able to compare different types of landscape features and composition, and we can also see that added effect too. So the first thing I did was I developed a nest abundance model across our range, and then I also looked at reproductive performance of those nests across these different types of landscapes across those gradients. There's an ongoing joke that the Ferruginous Hawk project has personally contributed to climate change, and that's because we drove all over the prairies. We covered so much ground. Ferruginous hawks can be very dense in some areas, but a lot of them are extremely spread out. So we were just driving all the time. And so giving talks like this is part of my penance for doing this type of work. But it provided really great data and it helped us learn a lot about how things like land cover, industrial development, and climate can influence nest abundance. Again, there are some landscape predictors that can predict nest abundance across townships. And we just chose townships because it was sort of a management unit, something tangible that we could work with. They were influenced by how much grassland was in the system or in the landscape and how much edge. And it seems again that they like to have a mix of both grassland and cropland and some edge. Then after that abundance model, we felt like we had a pretty good handle on which landscapes could potentially have more nests or more home ranges than others and what could predict it. Then we looked at reproductive performance. So we wanted to know, well, depending on where these birds are nesting, does their reproductive performance match up to it? So again, we monitored nests all over the prairies. We checked on them about once a week. Sometimes we had so many nests over such a large area, we couldn't monitor all of them. But you can still see that we had a massive effort here with over 1,500 nest attempts and over 10,000 nest visits, and 900 unique nests too. It was a lot of work. We monitored these nests and estimated nest survival, and we monitored for clutch size and fledging rates so that we could see if there were any landscape predictors for it. So there's a suite of variables that came out in the top model, but I'll kind of hit the highlights, interesting highlights. Nest survival was well predicted by the density of oil wells in area. And this is specifically oil and not natural gas or helium. So in landscapes, they had a high density, their nest survival was predicted to be the poorest. A really strong relationship that we also found was how cold the previous winter was. So if it was really cold the winter before, their nest survival was pretty good. And we speculate that this is likely related back to Richardson ground squirrels that share a similar survival pattern. They do better in cold winters because they stay underground and they do well. Thermoregulating or not thermoregulating, I guess, I don't, depending on how you describe hibernation. But there's probably more ground squirrels out and about in the season after a very cold winter, which was really, really neat. And then we did see some relationships again with landscape. And so the amount of grass and the amount of edge was a pretty good predictor not a bad predictor for nest survival. Taking all of these landscape, climate, industrial variables, again, building a predictive map, then here again, we can create a map that predicts where their nest survival would be predicted to be the highest and places where we would predict nest survival to be lower. And you can actually see some of those oil, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can actually see in this top north corner here, the oil density field, those oil fields that have a high density of oil wells actually pop up as low survival there. So it's a predictive map that can be used in any which way that you would like. So I did a lot, it was a pretty modeling, it was a fieldwork intensive PhD. It was a, like many, stats heavy PhD and GIS heavy. And so the fun part is, I mean, what did we learn? What's new? What's exciting? But then also from a conservation biology sense, how can we apply it? What does it actually teach us about how to do better for Ferruginous hawks because they are a species at risk? Well, a lot of Ferruginous hawks, or a lot of people are excited about putting nest platforms out for Ferruginous hawks because it's like putting a really, really big birdhouse and getting the ultimate bluebird coming to it to nest at it. But the question is like, okay, just because we can put it out there, does that mean that it's actually a good thing? Well, we found a huge difference in nests when they were in a platform versus in a natural structure like a tree. With these severe storms, after every severe storm, we would go out and we would find Ferruginous hawk nests blown or knocked out of trees. Same thing, we would find nests on the ground in the spring after winter, and these are ones that get too heavy. The tree just shakes too much, knocks everybody out, and we actually see a lot of nest failures. We actually see 7 or 8% of all nests. No, 7 to 8% of all nests are a result of nest failure from the structure blowing out, and that's a huge percentage. And so platforms are actually like pretty bomb proof if you if it's not me building, if it's somebody who can build one, then they're actually pretty good for keeping a nest like nice and stable. And so there's a lot of people who already put nest platforms out for a variety of reasons. And so then if it's a good idea and it's a good place and maybe they're using a habitat model to predict where to put that nest, then a platform can actually be pretty helpful. The other thing that we've learned about Ferruginous hawks from this study is more about what types of landscapes do we expect them to be found, and where do we what characteristics of those landscapes do we predict to have an influence on nest survival. That's all fine and dandy. Habitat selection studies, great, good story. But again, applying it is so interesting because as I mentioned before, they've always been considered this like native grassland species. But it turns out they're kind of like, they like that heterogeneous landscape. So how does that help us make management and conservation decisions on the ground, actually out in southern Saskatchewan? Well, when folks like NCC, folks in south of the Divide, other people that have interests in conservation easements and setting land aside, I think could benefit from this because the focus has always been large contiguous tracts of grassland. That's like literally the flagship line that comes with all the brochures about conserving native grassland. And that's really important and it's really good because it serves a lot of species that need that type of landscape, big prairie. But it's also going to show that it's not necessarily the biggest bang for your buck for a species like Ferruginous hawks that like those heterogeneous landscapes. And what I think is even more important is that it actually gives us an argument to target conservation, prioritize some conservation for those smaller chunks of prairie near those large tracts of prairie. Because those postage-sized little bits here and there that are on the outskirts of those large tracts, they are probably fairly at risk of being converted into cropland because they're probably in good soils, because they have more cropland that's around it. It's just hypothesis, but probably a well-grounded one. So we're actually probably more in danger of losing some of those postage stamps, which we've always wondered, well, should we be conserving them, or should we be putting resources towards them, or should we be focusing on the big ones? Well, then, if we're looking to wait, if there's any NCC sponsors out here, then I guess my suggestion here would be conserving, protecting, managing for those smaller chunks of prairie near large contiguous tracts of grassland, then would be the biggest bang for your buck for conserving and providing habitat, protecting habitat for Ferruginous hawks. And yeah, it's an argument to take that direction with it. The results from the study also provided some insight that folks on the ground can use to manage for industrial infrastructure. And so folks that are trying to um, avoid building new infrastructure near Ferruginous Hawks, because Ferruginous Hawks have a 1,000-meter setback distance and a timing restriction around them. They're kind of a pain to work around. And so if you're looking to build, then you're also not looking just for, say, where the resource is, but hey, where's your lowest liability away from Ferruginous Hawks? The predictive maps that I created are also currently being used by the Alberta Fish and Wildlife, Alberta government by Fish and Wildlife, because they're using that predictive map to identify target areas to actually rip out oil and gas wells, because they know that it's probably not great for Ferruginous hawks, or at least they're associated with something that's not great for Ferruginous hawks. And so, and Alberta and many parts of Saskatchewan also have so many orphan oil and gas wells that it's like, where do you start taking these out? Where do you start reclaiming and restoring the landscape? Here's a map. Go for the dark colors, do some work there. That'll improve the landscape, maybe for Ferruginous hawks and probably for other species too. Then, yeah, we found, I mean, it was a big study. We found a lot of really interesting things, and identifying hawk habitat and what's good for them is important for building things like recovery strategies the provincial and federal government are interested in. We learned more about what can be negatively affecting this population, and we've provided some evidence-driven tools, things like predictive maps and models for them to use to make some decisions and do some work that's on the ground too. So one of those tools is sort of like this really obvious question is how do we keep Ferruginous hawks safe from growing wind power that's out on the landscape? And so then we've got these predictive maps, and then there's also these published or these publicly available data maps of windy areas, or where areas that have the highest potential for wind development because they've got all the characteristics that wind farm developers are interested in. And it's really a matter of overlaying these things. It's where are hawks? Where are the hawks? Where are the windy places? Where are there not hawks? And where is it not as windy? And so really these maps, and they can be updated as these wind models and transmission line builds go on. But really there's, compared to the whole range that's in Canada, there's actually very small chunks that are really bad or predicted to be really bad for Ferruginous hawks relative to wind power. So these are areas where there's lots of Ferruginous hawks that are very windy. And so in my mind, these are areas to potentially avoid. And really, there's not that much to avoid to already do a better job at keeping birds safe. And we've also got areas that, using these same maps, we've got areas that have very low density or very low abundance of hawks on the landscape that are still very windy. So if you're going to build wind and you wanted to avoid hawks, or at least nesting hawks, then there's lots of great places for you to build here in the prairies. And then there's places where, because development happens, we can't move every wind farm perfectly to avoid every single thing. And so sometimes there are people who are interested in habitat offsets or mitigation. And so they're looking for places to conserve or protect that they probably don't want to develop in either, long-term planning. And so we've also overlaying these same maps. We've got places that have lots of hawks that are not very windy. And so if you're a wind developer that are interested in providing offsets, then here's a map. Use it, do good things in these blue hatched areas. Then these same maps, I mean, really, we've got a habitat model for how abundant they are, and then we've got a nest survival predictive map too. And so I mentioned earlier in my talk that we're interested in looking at potential mismatches across the landscape. And so there's a lot of text here, but really we're interested in identifying places that, identifying landscapes where there's high abundance and reproduction is good, because that, if you're going to protect or set things aside, maybe that's really good. That's a good place to work on Ferruginous hawks there. Same thing for secondary habitat, lots of birds, reproduction, pretty good. And then in terms of on the ground changes to the landscape, how can we do better for Ferruginous hawks? Identifying those areas where nest abundance seems pretty high, but the reproduction is mismatched to be low. Say, for example, they're nesting in areas that have some oil, that have a high density of oil wells. So they're selecting for those areas, but their reproduction is low because it's correlated to that proximity. Then those are areas, again, as I mentioned, Fish and Wildlife are using to target where to do reclamation and restoration as high priority, so high concern areas, and then moderate concern where there's some nest and their nest survival isn't where we would like to see it. So then, same thing. It's I did a lot of mapping, and I still do a lot of mapping, and it's overlaying the abundance and nest survival map and seeing what comes out as places that are pretty good, and then also places where we can improve on, and that helps people make decisions about where to put their resources. All right, so I think my take home, because I'm always still having the conversation about Ferruginous hawks being really big native grassland advocates, and they are. They just need a mix of a few other things in the landscape too to live their best life. And so Ferruginous hawks like to have a heterogeneous landscape where they prefer and select for these landscapes for habitat use, and their reproductive performance is positively correlated to it too. Again, we found climate predictors in our nest select or home range selection model, and weather as pretty good predictors for reproduction. And so that also means that we're not only trying to manage for the landscape at this time, but decision making also needs to include climate change to consider what that landscape might look like and what might be affecting Ferruginous hawks into the future. All right, so yeah, we had so much wonderful support that provided funding, in-kind support for this project. And again, I worked with Aaron and Troy, who yeah, we built a good project together. So if anybody has any questions, they can still shoot me an email, and I think we've got some time still today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janet. It was an amazing talk, very interesting and very relevant. And I can see that people are already asking some questions in the